This is not just another analysis of international politics. This lecture has a single purpose: to help you understand how wars truly began, not through weapons, but through the architecture of the human mind. Because wars do not start with bullets. They start with psychology. They emerge when four forces converge: fear, legitimacy, collective narrative, and the instinct to preserve power. When these elements align, a nation does not stumble into war. It moves toward it deliberately, often without realizing it. At this point, we must turn to an unexpected source: the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Though it speaks about death, its deeper message is far more unsettling. Human beings, in moments of fear, mistake their own illusions for reality. Now consider this carefully. What is true for individuals is also true for nations. A leader constructs an external enemy to justify internal control. The public, gripped by anxiety, begins to accept that narrative as truth, and gradually the entire society shifts toward extremity. This is how systems evolve, where only hardliners survive. Now we arrive at a critical question. Can external intervention change such a system? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Provide weapons. Support opposition groups. Trigger reform from within. But this assumption is dangerously naive, because real-world power structures are not governed by morality. They are governed by competing interests, survival strategies, and uncontrollable group psychology. Let's dismantle a fundamental illusion. Opposition does not equal reform. Inside a country like Iran, there is no single unified reformist force. Instead, there are fragmented actors, paramilitary groups driven by local interests, a conventional military inclined toward regime stability, peripheral ethnic groups pursuing autonomy or independence. Their goals are not aligned. There is no cohesive vision of reform, only overlapping, often conflicting agendas. This is why external arming strategies almost always fail. History has demonstrated this repeatedly in conflicts like Afghanistan and Syria. The outcomes share common patterns. First, loss of control. Proxy forces do not remain proxies. Over time, they become independent actors with their own agendas. Second, acceleration of fragmentation. When multiple factions receive weapons, cooperation collapses. Competition intensifies. The result? Not reform, but civil war. Third, collapse of legitimacy. The moment external backing becomes visible, so-called reform groups are no longer seen as liberators, but as instruments of foreign influence. And with that, they lose internal support. Fourth, and most critically, the backlash effect. The stronger the external pressure, the stronger the internal hardliners become. Why? Because external threat narratives become more credible. They unify the population. They justify repression. They consolidate power. From a political psychology perspective, this is the turning point. When a society perceives external danger, it reacts predictably. We are under attack. We must unite. And in that moment, moderates fall silent. Hardliners rise. Now consider the geopolitical dimension. Iran is not an isolated state. It is the center of a regional network linked to Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and beyond. Any internal armed conflict does not remain internal. It expands rapidly. So if external intervention fails, what actually leads to change? The answer is structural, not tactical. First, internal legitimacy must erode. Change does not come from outside pressure. It comes when internal conditions become unbearable. Economic collapse plays a key role, but only when it reaches a critical threshold. Hyperinflation, mass unemployment, shortages of essential goods. When survival itself is threatened, ideology loses its power. Second, elite fragmentation. This is the decisive variable. Systems do not collapse because of the masses. They collapse when elites divide. In Iran, power rests on three pillars: religious leadership, the Revolutionary Guard, political bureaucracy. If these pillars fracture, the system ceases to function. Third, the collapse of legitimacy through shock events. Regimes are not sustained by force alone, but by belief. That belief breaks when large-scale corruption is exposed, civilians suffer mass casualties, or leadership fails morally. At that moment, something shifts. Fear transforms into anger. Obedience becomes doubt. Fourth, generational change. Time is the most underestimated force in politics. Younger generations are less bound by ideological narratives, have greater access to global information, and prioritize individual autonomy. The old language of sacrifice no longer resonates. Finally, the convergence of internal fractures and external pressure. External pressure alone cannot trigger change, but when it aligns with internal instability, the effect can be explosive. So let us return to the core question. Why doesn't a hardline regime collapse from within? The answer is simple. Because while collapse is possible, what comes after is uncontrollable. And that uncertainty is often more dangerous than the system itself. The Tibetan Book of the Dead leaves us with a warning. In fear, humans become trapped inside the illusions they create. Nations are no exception. If we fail to recognize fear, we do not see reality. We see narratives, constructed, reinforced, believed. And that brings us to the real purpose of this lecture. Not to tell you what to think, but to show you what you are not seeing. Because once you recognize the structure, you are no longer easily manipulated. You begin to see beyond the headlines, beyond the noise, into the system itself. In the next lecture, The Collapse of Iran, Part 2, we will go deeper. When and why elite factions begin to fracture, and the precise moment a system truly begins to fall. If this analysis helped you see more clearly, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing, because understanding these structures is not just academic, it is essential.